Okay, exciting to be here. Scary, but exciting. It's really interesting times to be talking about health when the average lifetime keeps increasing, and increasing to the extent where scientists tell us they're not sure there actually is a limit. The challenge, unfortunately, is that the same logic seems to apply to healthcare expenditures. That keeps growing. And what we realize is that the very ways that got us this far simply does not suffice any longer. And this isn't only a question of health, because we also see that flows of people, goods, information, ideas, and knowledge is also increasing rapidly. And with all those flows increasing, so is the social, economic, and environmental impact of those flows. So now we know that we really have to find ways to rapidly transform the way society works, change our cities, our welfare systems, our value chains, and our consumption patterns into something more sustainable. We also understand that we're in a hurry to do so. So the challenge is tremendous. And at the same time, the opportunities are also tremendous. Because it turns out that we've created all these new opportunities for ourselves to organize resources more efficiently than we ever have before. We have only recently begun to really acknowledge that it seems like we have created something very special. We understand that digital is not an industry filled with startups and consultants, but digital is rather a new dimension that we've created for ourselves. We always had to take into account time and space every time we wanted to solve a problem, come together to produce something. And now, regardless if we talk about our clothes, the physical spaces we're in, the vehicles we travel in, the value chains related to health, we have this new dimension of digital to take into account. And it changes things. It changes our expectations of how things should work. It changes how we can organize ourselves. And to just take a step back and begin thinking about how this change comes about, typically, let me ask you, how many of you use this kind of app? Maps. All of you. Because no person at their right mind would currently sit in a car and with open eyes drive into a traffic jam, right? Why would you ever do such a thing when you can take your way behind it? Why would you ever sit in any kind of transport and not know pretty much exactly when you're going to get where you want to get to? Now, ask yourselves, did you really demand this service before you got it? Were you rioting to get hold of these type of services? Or if one would have asked you, say 10 years ago, would you like to have digital maps in your mobile phones when you drive your car? You would have said, why on earth should I? When I'm in my car, I look at the road. How long did it take you to start using this on an everyday level? Did it take you like months of convincing and, not really wanting to? Weeks? Or did it take you maybe 1 or 2 experiences to completely change your mind and think this is the natural way to go about planning your journeys, right? So when we get these experiences that we didn't ask for, but that give us a zero-friction experience that radically lower friction, saves us time, lower risk, we change in the blink of an eye. And nothing is sacred anymore, literally nothing. Turns out that the same kind of hunt for zero-friction experiences makes us now mix our gene pools in a different way. So it used to be that when we got married, we married this person that we actually had some sort of social connection to, a friend knew a friend, and that's no longer true because zero friction, swipe right. Turns out that these days, people are marrying complete strangers, or at least people who used to be complete strangers until, we hooked up and met online. And so that's something really nice to think about occasionally when I feel, despairing at the speed of change, that once we get these opportunities, we do change as individuals. And now we see that as individuals, we are changing our behavior in relationship to health. So the online doctors' meetings are already experiencing double-digit growth. With double-digit, that means we're months away from having a digital experience as the natural first contact for pretty much any kind of health episode. Now, health professionals I talk to typically say, Yeah, we know. The online doctors, they can handle the occasional rash, maybe a bruise, but seriously, at a real healthcare center, we can do so much more than that, which is entirely true. They can. But as we heard, at the expense of travel time, 6-hour waiting in line, etc., they can do also bruises. But what if I have a bruise and I don't want to wait in line? What is the value of the experience of 2 minutes waiting time? And the speed in which this offer to us as patients grow is the speed of innovation. Because what we can actually take care of from a distance changes when we have these kind of innovations. This is basically just a glorified objective that you put on your camera, but I've been talking to the doctors who actually use that to diagnose ear infection, one of the most common things to search acute healthcare for. And they say, we've never had such a great view of the inner ear ever before. Turns out that sometimes we can reorganize, digitalize, and both make it more efficient and increase quality. Let me get back to that. And so where are the limitations of what we can do if we see that we can already have digestible sensors on pills? That when they hit our stomach, they use the acids in our stomach to close the battery circuit, to get just enough energy to ping a badge on our arm that collects some more data, pushes it up into our mobile phone and further into the cloud. What is the societal cost right now of us not knowing if patients actually take their medication? Rather, we know that they keep forgetting it. What's the cost of the clinical trials that need to figure out how this functional molecule actually works in your body compared to yours, when we still have trouble finding out if you remember to take the pill? So what will that mean in terms of increasing speed of innovation, but also in terms of what we can offer in a different way when we already have home packaged CRP tests, STD tests, to the extent where people in healthcare tell us that we believe, actually, that more people seek treatment for STDs now because they can do so from the comfort of their home. It makes it more difficult to trace the illnesses and treat others, but on the other hand, more people get treatment. And by the way, we've noticed that people are apparently seeking help. They're more comfortable sending dick pics through their mobiles, so they're also, seeking healthcare. And we're seeing the potential of actually having our medical kits at home filled with these types of tests, but also other tests, maybe even testing us for serious diseases as cancer. So I believe the entire audience here agrees that we know that to transform into sustainable societies in terms of health, we need personalization, we need proactive care, and we need to optimize each treatment, each episode in a different way. And we need to do that by organizing it differently. So one super interesting thing that I think we talk about too little is how these digitalization does not exchange the thing we have, but takes certain slices of it and radically transforms it. Take a urine infection, for instance. A urine infection is currently one of the most common diseases that other healthy women would seek acute health for. A urine infection does not require a test or any physical examination to be diagnosed. It only requires a structured interview. As it happens, when we make that interview digital through an app, the quality goes up. Because the app does not forget to ask the question that a stressed out nurse or doctor can occasionally forget to ask. You're answering these questions from the comfort of your home with a waiting time counted in seconds. And the doctor who does the diagnosis in the end says, it used to take me 30 minutes to make the diagnosis of a urine infection, but right now it takes me 2. So what we're not talking about enough is how do you then organize not the primary care facilities, but urine infections. Basically, we could take all urine infections in Sweden and send them to 5 urine infection specialized doctors that work from Bahamas. I admit it doesn't sound like a nice job, so we have to have some perks. Or we could take all of these urine infections and push them as push notifications through mobile phones to all doctors that have the right skill set to actually diagnose it, and they can do it by the coffee machine. I'm not saying we should organize it any of those ways, but it's really, really interesting to admit that how we can now take certain diagnoses and organize them is radically different from how we used to do it. And it's not a matter of taking all of primary care or all of anything. And it's not limited only to primary care and the simple diagnoses that can almost be automized. We can look at the other side of the spectrum and look at super specialized care. And this is an example that was very personal for me because my dad, a couple of years ago, was diagnosed with angioimmunoblastic T-cell lymphoma. Now that's something you don't want. It has a 15% survival chance, and it's a really, really mean type of blood cancer. So I spent a lot of time Googling, reading up on research papers that were typically a year old because I couldn't get behind the payment walls where the newer stuff was. And I realized early on that his only chance of survival would be stem cell therapies. And even with those, he would have a 15% chance of survival. Now, if I would have seen this, that didn't exist back then. China announces medical tourism. They have an island called Hainan Island with specially written legislation to offer the world highly specialized experimental stem cell treatment. If I would not have had my dad get that in Stockholm, you bet he would have been on a plane to China. What does it mean to a generation of millennials to have this level of transparency of treatment options and at the same time have the habit of traveling the world multiple times before they hit puberty? Going to China is not a big deal. What does that mean to citizen expectations on healthcare? What do these opportunities to organize differently means in terms of opportunities for new players to come with a global value proposition? We saw you saw the headlines from Amazon 2 weeks ago. The expectations of these kinds of organizations with that kind of consumer trust, with that kind of digital know-how, with that kind of physical infrastructure for data processing, with that kind of financial backing, what they could do. Imagine that. Or imagine Facebook. They already have the legal right to provide financial services in the European Union. What is stopping them from offering their 1.6 billion members global health insurance? Not replacing everything we do in public healthcare, of course not. Just giving us the most accessible, state-of-the-art quality in just the rash and the urine infection and the ear infection and the stuff we can do with the CRP test, etc. And at the same time, offering the super specialized things that we cannot get in a population of 4 or 5 or 10 million people. What does that mean? What I think it means is that it's not a question of what kind of actors will replace public health care. Of course not. But it will not be a comparative offer. New players are going to take chunks and chunks and chunks of what we're currently offering in the public welfare and do them better at global scale. And when they do, things tend to follow. We've seen it in other industry. Consumer behavior, your behavior changes pretty quickly. Demand changes, expectations changes. Massive power shifts happen. Massive value aggregation happens. And as this happens, as society takes steps into a more digital and even more global world, also in this public service value chains, we build in new vulnerabilities into the system. And that's nothing new. I mean, my grandfather grew up in the northern Sweden. He could actually take a knife, walk into the woods, and come back 6 months later, fairly well off. Now, if the food store across the street would close down, me and my kids would starve in about a week. Basically, I'm not supposed to live. I'm so dependent on these complex value chains that give me food and shelter, right? But I don't lie awake at night worrying about what will happen if the port in Rotterdam closes down, as maybe I should, because if it does, we starve. We learn to manage that. Now we have new vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities such as realizing that there will be consequences that we haven't seen beforehand, that we have to deal with. For instance, algorithms trained on historical data that was selected through a process of human bias will, if put in scale, increase those biases, increase differences and inequalities. Now, what's the state responsibility to provide a feedback loop when that happens, to offer transparency in terms of what these algorithms are actually doing? What should we be demanding? And it's not a matter of a question between private and public, because please note that China already has a pure digital credit score where they don't only take into account whether people are actually paying their bills and should be allowed to take loans, but also take into account how they behave in social media and what kind of content they post there. And it's not only going to be used to decide who can take a bank loan and what kind of credit you will be awarded, but also what kind of schools your kids can go to and whether you're trusted with riding an airplane to other countries. All of this is taking place in a time where we have to admit that what digitalization actually means is a major reorganization of all of human society. And we are already seeing it happening. So let's just acknowledge that just through us changing our behavior, big shifts are happening in terms of value and the work market. So in the US, for instance, last year, they actually had 100,000 jobs in retail disappear in only 4 months. That's more jobs than the total amount of jobs in the coal industry that Donald Trump won the election for. At the same time, however, 100,000 new jobs were created in completely different places, in the warehouse of the e-commerce retailers that we are now shopping from. Jobs that require completely different skill sets, with completely different terms. And most of the new jobs that are being created, and we see this both in Europe and in the US, are actually made out of independent workers. Independent workers are a diverse group, most of which actually do this voluntarily because they think that it's better for them to be independent and work across geographies and organizations as they see fit or they have opportunities. And this will only increase as we see impact of initiatives like this. So Google last spring launched an initiative called Google Job Search. It aims at indexing every single job ad in the world, including payment benefits. Now imagine getting that personalized search where you will see and your colleagues will see the kind of opportunity, given the skill set, that you would have all over the planet. Where would you like to live this month? I believe it's easy to underestimate how much this will drive mobility in the world workforce. Again, especially thinking about millennials who already traveled the world since before puberty, who actually have experience in collaborating with people from other countries, not from school, but from Minecraft. It's not that difficult to stretch out a hand and ask somebody, what would it be like to work where you are? Not when you see this. It's important to remember that jobs are not necessarily bad or unfair just because they're organized through digital services and platforms, but such a job market definitely needs to be organized differently, and that's putting a strain on our systems. Adding to that, what McKinsey has shown us, and McAfee Brynolfsson did this research where they showed that 47% of all jobs can be automated within the next couple of decades. But the point is, a lot of the work will be optimized, but with very few jobs. So what we do know is that if you're a doctor or a nurse or a teacher, an economist or a lawyer, or a warehouse worker, what we all have in common is now that the speed is increasing in which we have to change not professions, but tools and work processes. How we do things, not the profession itself. And that's why I would say that one of the biggest challenges that all countries, but especially welfare states, really need to address now is that right now the differences are growing. The differences between the people who have the ability and the drive to learn and adapt and to turn these new opportunities into opportunities for themselves, and those who don't have that. Those who actually still rely on a system that told us, born in the 60s and 70s and 80s, that if you get an education and a degree, and then you have a collective agreement that promises you 5 days training per year, you're in the safe, we're screwed. So these differences are increasing. The differences between organizations that have the ability to take these new technologies, not have lofty strategies about world dominance, but actually acknowledging that they are there and putting them into use, improving their efficiency, improving their customer experiences, changing their offer to market, and those organizations who don't have that. And I believe that the same is true for countries. The nations that have it in them to take these new opportunities and actually turn it into transformation of how to address health, in how to address education, in how to organize our transport system, and those who don't have that are also increasing. And for that matter, one of my key messages to a Swedish audience, and then obviously also to Finnish, would be this. I think it's bad for us to think about ourselves as nations. Because seriously, with 10 million people or 4 million people, we're not really a nation in a globalized world. We're one city. We're one London, we're one Shenzhen, and we need to be able to add value in that kind of context. For that, we have to think hard about this. We built our welfare state based on these principles. Equal opportunity. But equal opportunity is now put under stress by the fact that everybody has to change their way of working, the kind of knowledge they apply at work, and that the ability to do so varies a lot. We built it on the basis of equitable value distribution, but that also is quite radically challenged when the value chains become even more globalized, when we see platform economies coming up with extreme value aggregation. And I agree with Eric Schmidt, the chairman of Alphabet, who says that if we want to do something about this, we probably have to talk about international tax agreements. Now, where's the place for Nordic countries in that equation? What kind of impact will we have on that kind of discussion? Do we care? Are we there? And the third principle of public responsibility for all, but we meant for all within this geographical space. But that's not true anymore, with increased migration streams, both from people in need and from people with talent and skill, that puts completely different expectations on what public responsibility means. What does it mean if you're one of the people using housing services offered by companies that say, buy flat as a subscription. Do you want to live in London, Tokyo, Stockholm, or San Francisco next month? So what does a national welfare state need to do? Actually, I don't know. But what I do know is that we, A, have to see welfare state take responsibility for the digital infrastructure needed to make these changes scale and happen. And with that, I don't mean digital communism with ideas and dreams of state-owned major databases and systems that would effectively kill all innovation. But I mean the infrastructure in terms of governance processes, mandates that shows how we all in the industry can connect our services to each other and share data in a secure manner. That means we need to standardize how information exchange actually happens. And we have a good example in Estonia. I'm very happy to hear and see that Finland is actually ahead of Sweden there. But that is something that the regulatory parties need to take responsibility for, but it needs to be open, and that's how we create functional markets where we can innovate the way we work, where we can innovate the consumer experience, where we can innovate the actual services being applied. But for that to happen, data needs to flow between apps and systems and solutions and stakeholders. The other thing we really need to address is to find the recipe for real lifelong learning. How does that happen? What are the responsibilities in between the unions, the employers, the higher education, the state, in terms of solving it financially, in terms of making the right education available, in terms of setting the incentives? How do we do that? I believe that the Nordics could be the first countries to actually nail that, find that recipe, and that would give us a really interesting advantage. And the last tricky thing is, how do we create the possibility of mixing these globalized offers within healthcare and education with the traditional welfare state? I do believe that if we look back and try to preserve what we built on geographic hegemony, we will fail. But if we allow ourselves to try to embrace these new opportunities and realize how can we build the opportunity of creating global welfare solutions that works for our citizens and others, then we will create something truly, truly interesting in this world that we're living in. So personally, I'm thrilled to be alive at this time. Be part of this generation where it's actually our responsibility to make sure that this transformation happens, to find the answers of how this should be. And that's why I'm super excited to be here, and I'm really looking forward to learning more about how you're thinking in Finland and what the Nordics should do more together. And with that, I'm out. Thank you.